Recently, Theresa May has announced that every secondary school in England will be offered mental health training in a bid to end stigma and help children. Every secondary school will be offered mental health first aid training. Employers will be given additional training in supporting staff who need to take time off, and trials on strengthening links between schools and NHS specialist staff, including a review of children and services across the country led by Care Quality Commission. Seeing as 1 in 10 children between 5 and 16 suffer from a mental illness, do you agree that this will be an effective scheme?
Yes, I think introducing training into schools would be beneficial because other than the parents or guardians, teachers see the children or the students more often than anybody else.
Given the present circumstances in schools, how do you think this scheme will be sustained?
Well, workload for teachers is heavy, but this is such an important issue that it does need to be incorporated somewhere into the school day.
It's commonly known that students within education are put under a lot of stress, such as exams and social settings. Does this make them more vulnerable to mental illness, seeing as that they may not be prepared for secondary education?
I think the pressures of school are handled differently by different students. Some do find it hard, and it can contribute to and exaggerate the symptoms of mental illness.
You already have to plan lessons, mark work, attend work meetings, deal with troublesome students, as well as balancing your personal life. Bearing all this in mind, is the scheme realistic?
It is realistic if clear guidelines are given and training for teachers. Currently in schools there are named people for special educational needs and child protection which deal with issues in school, so that the class teachers can just refer students and any problems they have or anything that they see that might be wrong, they can refer those on to those allocated members of staff, and they will be further trained to deal with it. So something similar could be useful, and that would also obviously ease the workload of the regular class teacher.
Before now, has there ever been a time in the workday for teachers to make students aware of mental illness and how to handle it?
I guess it comes into the curriculum in some places, such as citizenship, PSHE, but it's not enough, I think, for what we need in schools.
When looking back on your teaching career, do you think mental illness amongst students was more prominent when you began or now?
I would imagine that it's very similar from when I began teaching nearly 20 years ago to now. However, awareness has made it more so that we can spot the illnesses, the mental illnesses more, so it may look like it's more common, but I think it's probably always been there.
Taking into account the growth in technology, for example social media, do you think this has increased the amount of emotional distress in children?
Yes, in years gone by, students could get away from bullying at home, but now it's 24/7, and things like bullying, I do think, can contribute to mental illness and how it affects the student.
Have you ever yourself had an encounter with a student suffering from mental illness, and did you feel like you had enough experience to deal with the situation?
I think the fact is that I probably have encountered many students with varying degrees of mental illness, but however these have probably in many cases been missed through lack of training and knowledge.
Do you think the children would benefit from this scheme?
Yes, a recent study suggested that 95% of young offenders have in fact a mental illness, and this needs to be addressed. This needs to be caught early.
On average, this project will cost taxpayers £15 million. Do you see this as a drawback, and what other aspects hold it back?
Well, clearly spending huge amounts of the taxpayers' money can be seen as a drawback. However, going back to my previous point, about 95% of the young offenders having some sort of mental condition, hopefully if we spend the money early, we can save more later on through reforming and the health service.
Do you think students could take advantage of this scheme by falsely claiming they suffer from a mental illness for attention? What would schools do to stop this happening and ensure that the correct students receive the right treatments?
Well, all schools will have their own policy on behaviour issues. However, there will always be people that abuse the system, and maybe you could argue that that in itself is a form of mental illness. However, if the correct training is put in place for key members of staff, hopefully that those genuinely in need can be separated from those who are not.
So overall, do you think this scheme will benefit students and teachers around the UK?
Yes, I do. I think that it needs to be addressed early on in school, and we can save money that we spend later on through not needing so much for the prison system and for health services later. The only downside really, other than the money, the financial side, would be the workload. So it does need to be set up in a manageable way so that it is not putting unnecessary pressure on teachers.
Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
In conclusion, mental health needs to be full in schools, otherwise in future years it will just escalate out of control.